I got involved in church state about 3.5 years ago through Meetup. Any of you know what Meetup is? You see it online. It's people meet up for everything from orchids to veterans of foreign wars. But there was one on separation of church and state, and I've learned a lot since then. Two things that I've learned is that the number of people who would like to use the First Amendment for their own benefit outnumber us by a huge margin, tens of thousands. I've also learned that no matter what we do, they're not going away. So it's very important that we have people on our side, as our speaker tonight, who have been willing to dedicate their lives to this cause for all of us. With that said, I want to introduce him. He's an author of several books. One of my favorites is this short book, and I bone up on it when I know I'm going to be around people who want to tell me that this is a Christian nation. And it's called Congress Shall Make No Law Respecting an Establishment of Religion and Why the Religious Right is Wrong. He also has written a couple of other books. He's a senior political analyst in the Washington, D.C. office. Some of you have seen him on CNN, Fox News. He goes right into the belly of the beast, and he takes them all on. And so with that said, I'd like to introduce Rob Boston.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor, and I mean that sincerely. Those of us who work in the National Office of Americans United are well aware that we could not do the work that we do without your support and your activism. So I appreciate your coming out this night to hear what I have to say. I have worked at Americans United for more than 23 years, and it has been an interesting experience for me. And my life, of course, has changed quite a lot over those 23 years. But some things have sort of remained the same. And one of the things that's been constant is the never-ending battle for those who just don't support the concept of separation of church and state. And I remember back when I was looking into this type of work and checking out this job, it sort of struck me as kind of surprising that there were people who didn't support the separation of church and state. Kind of like not supporting free speech or freedom of the press. I mean, it's such a basic constitutional principle and part of our lives. Yet, there are forces out there, well-organized, well-funded, very active, that absolutely do not support the separation of church and state. And one of the things that occurred to me was that in a way to sort of understand these forces a little bit better, it would be best to check them out up close and personal. So that's what I did and still do quite a bit of. Go to religious right meetings, listen to what these folks are saying, listen to their leaders, check out their websites. And I have had some interesting experiences. I remember once being in the 90s when the Promise Keepers were kind of big. You might remember the Promise Keepers. They had a meeting at RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C., and I went to that. And there were 40,000 men there singing Rock of Ages and praising Jesus and doing lots of interesting things. And I was among them and trying to get a handle on this movement and understand it because it appeared to be becoming a little more political at that time. It's not nearly as prominent now as it was then, but it was very popular for a number of years. The Christian Coalition, which is an organization founded by the television evangelist Pat Robertson, used to hold annual meetings in Washington, D.C., and I always went to those. That group is much less prominent now. But its place has been taken by another organization called the Family Research Council, and they have an annual meeting called the Values Voters Summit in Washington, D.C., which I attend every year as well. And of course, as Steve mentioned, I've done some sparring in the media with various leaders of the religious right, and I've argued with them on Fox News Channel and CNN and MSNBC and other outlets. And Barry Lynn, who's our director, some of you may know him, he's a United Church of Christ minister. He's really the one who is most of the time out there in the media going up against these folks. I'm sort of the pinch hitter. If he's unavailable, if he's traveling or just can't do it, I'll step in, but that's normally his job and his task. What I want to talk to you tonight about, and I'll be happy to take any questions you have after I'm done speaking, so hold those, but I want to talk to you a little bit about some challenges we face and some opportunities, because right now we're in a very interesting period relating to the separation of church and state. Due to a number of changes in the political system and recent changes there, we are seeing some things happening that I think are going to really affect this issue very powerfully. At the same time, there are changes to America's cultural and religious landscape that are underway that you may not even really be aware of that are happening that are also going to affect this issue in a powerful way. And we need to be aware of that, and we need to be thinking about how best to respond to these things. So I'm going to lay out a series of challenges, talk about some opportunities, and then we'll wrap up and I'll take any questions or comments you have. The first challenge I want to talk to you about is one that I think you're probably very well aware of, because if you've been following the media, you know what's happened in Washington, D.C. and in many state capitals over the last few months. How many of these social issues, or so-called culture war issues, have really just reemerged very powerfully, in a very strong way. We're seeing a spate of laws curbing access to legal abortion. We're seeing a number of laws aimed at defunding Planned Parenthood. We are seeing people trying to pass legislation to curb the rights of gays and lesbians. We're seeing renewed efforts to bring religion into the public school system. Lots of things going on in this area. And just a few years ago, a lot of us probably thought that these issues were going to lose some of their power, because we had an election in 2008 with a Democratic president and a more progressive Congress. At least that was seemed to be the direction we were headed in. But of course, the political winds in this country can shift very rapidly. And in fact, that's what happened in 2010 in the midterm election. In many ways, it's very similar to what happened in 1992 with the election of Bill Clinton, and 2 years later, the rise of a very conservative Congress led by people like Newt Gingrich, who is now back on the scene again politically. So we're seeing almost history replaying itself. And when we had the 2008 election, I remember listening to some of the pundits acting as if there had been some sort of dramatic political realignment in the United States. And I remember thinking at that time, that's probably not likely. That isn't really the way politics in this country works, that you have that really just dramatic realignment. And certainly, that's not the way the religious right sees things. When they lose an election, they don't just pack up shop and go home. They start to work toward the next election. And in a way, the election of President Obama was very helpful to them, because it gave them a very visible target to attack, gave them a target to use for fundraising, for activism at the local level. And of course, that's what they've been doing. So that challenge, that reemergence of these culture war issues, is going to continue to reverberate through the political system for the next few years, regardless of what happens in 2012. These groups are newly energized. Their funding has been very strong, even though we're still in a bit of an economic downturn. Their activism and their funding is quite impressive. Annually, I take a look at the funding of the top 10 religious right organizations in America, and it approaches $1 billion annually that these organizations are raising, the top 10 religious right organizations, $1 billion. That's quite a lot of money. I mean, you can do a lot with $1 billion. So that's something that we need to be thinking about. And even some issues like that you may not necessarily think about as social issues are suddenly appearing in Congress with the religious right advocating for them. Let me give you an example. Some of you might have heard about the vote in Congress to defund National Public Radio. And there's been talk about their attack on, and they will next attack public broadcasting, PBS. And some of you might have thought, well, you know, this is kind of unusual, and where's this coming from? And maybe it's the Tea Party influence, and I'll talk about that too. But really, this has been a long-sought goal of the religious right, to defund public broadcasting, both at the radio and the television level. I mean, it's just something that they don't believe the government should be involved in. And for two reasons. Number one, they don't support many public services at all. They don't support public schools. They don't support public libraries. Why would they support public broadcasting? And secondly, they perceive that as having a liberal bias. So they want to shut that down. So their attack on National Public Radio should not have surprised anyone, although some folks were sort of taken aback by that. A second challenge sort of ties into that, and that is the rise of the Tea Party. Wherever I go, whenever I talk, people always ask me about the Tea Party. I mean, what is this movement? Where did it come from? Are they interested in social issues? Should we be concerned? Is it mainly a secular movement? Are they really interested in the budget, the deficit, spending? And it's a complex situation, but I will tell you that there's always been a bit of a nexus between the Tea Party and the religious right. The Pew Forum, which is an organization based in Philadelphia, does a lot of research about religion and the state of religion in America. It's good research. They've done some work on the Tea Party, and they've interviewed some individuals, and they've polled folks who are involved in this movement. And what they found is that most of the individuals involved in the Tea Party agree with the religious right on social issues. 89% say they agree with the religious right on social issues. So only 11% disagree. Now, that doesn't mean that all those people in the Tea Party are also members of religious right organizations. In fact, only about 40% are. So the religious right is looking at this movement and seeing it as a very powerful force, one that is philosophically in tune with them, and wanting to sort of find a way to link up. So at the religious right meetings that I've been going to over the past few years, there are obvious attempts to sort of woo the Tea Party and build a bridge to that organization. And to the extent that it is an organization, I mean, it's very decentralized. But there is definitely an effort to get them on board. And what they're trying to do is to create a type of really strong right-wing juggernaut that would bring together two strains of conservative thought in America today. One would be the culture war issues, and the other would be limited government, small government, low taxation, this sort of thing. I mean, those two wings have historically had a little bit of hostility to one another. The Tea Party is seen as an effort to kind of bridge that gap, and it's difficult to tell how exactly that's going to shake out, but definitely there's an effort underway there to bring those two into alignment. It's something we need to keep an eye on. So that's the second challenge, the challenge of the Tea Party and their efforts to link up with the religious right. The third challenge deals with the question of government funding of religion. And this is an issue that's been with our country for a long time. If you think about the so-called faith-based initiative, it's a contemporary example, a recent example of this phenomenon. And what's sort of discouraging about it is that for a long time in the United States, the understanding was that religious organizations would pay their own way. Your church was subsidized by the people sitting in the pews. If the church wanted to undertake some type of a social service ministry, they wanted to run a soup kitchen or provide services for people in need, well, your members paid for that. But during the Bush years, and actually a little bit before that, during the Clinton years, that began to change. When Bill Clinton was president, John Ashcroft was a senator from Missouri, and John Ashcroft, who was Attorney General for part of the Bush years, was very interested in this idea of bringing the religious community into the provision of social services with government money. Now that was kind of new and kind of not. Some religious organizations had been providing social services with government money for a long time. Catholic Charities is a good example. Catholic Charities is basically a ward of the state in many parts of the country. It gets about 70 to 75% of its budget from government sources. But Catholic Charities, despite its name, isn't extremely Catholic. It doesn't force its religion onto anybody. It serves people in various faiths, and it, generally speaking, usually hires people of non-Catholic persuasion. The Bush model was different. The Bush model said, well, we're going to bring these religious groups in, we're going to give them public funding, and we're going to tell them that they don't have to water down their religious identity. So they can continue to hire only Baptists if they're a Baptist church, or only fundamentalists if they're a conservative fundamentalist church. And obviously this has opened up a whole manner of difficulty and problem because some people are saying this is tax money. We don't want our tax money subsidizing religious discrimination. So that's a challenge. And it's still continuing because under President Obama we still have a faith-based initiative. President Obama talked about changing some of the features of the faith-based initiative when he was a candidate. He talked about ending the right of these groups to take public money, yet still discriminate on religious grounds when hiring staff, but he hasn't actually done anything to stop that. So we're seeing this program go on. It's very difficult to tell sometimes even how much money is moving through these religious organizations. It's something that we have a difficult time finding out, but we know that it's happening. Aside from that, we are seeing renewed efforts to fund religious schools again through voucher plans in many states and at the federal level in Washington, D.C. During the Bush years, there was a plan that started in the District of Columbia where vouchers were extended to private religious schools, and it was a 5-year experiment. That's how it was portrayed. Well, the 5 years came and they went, and they expired, and the plan ended. Studies were done. They showed that the students in the voucher schools weren't doing any better than their counterparts in the public school system, so one would look at those results and say, well, the experiment didn't work. But it's still being pushed. And Speaker of the House, John Boehner, is trying to revive this plan. In fact, there's supposed to be a vote this week in the House on this plan to bring it back into force. See, this is a battle really about ideology. And we have evidence from the U.S. Department of Education, no less, that showed that this plan in Washington, D.C. did not boost student achievement. Yet, Speaker Boehner and his allies continue to press this idea of government funding of religious education. And again, it goes back to what I said a minute ago, a bias toward public services and a desire to bring church and state closer together. And it's difficult to challenge in court because the Supreme Court a few years ago upheld a voucher plan in Ohio, so that sort of choked off the ability to go into the federal courts and litigate against these programs. So that's the third challenge, the challenge of government funding of religion. Active in many areas, something we definitely need to keep an eye on, and quite frankly, and I say this with some disheartening feeling, the Supreme Court is not as strong on this issue as they used to be. In the 1960s and 1970s, we had a strong Supreme Court, advocating for separation of church and state, upholding that principle, but that has changed. And the court now is looking at these funding programs and actually approving some of them, so it's a real problem. In some states, which are considering vouchers, we've had to look at the state constitutions instead and bring our challenges into the state courts whenever possible. Some states have very strong constitutions on separation of church and state. Others are not so strong, but we've really had to look more at the state level than the federal courts for that. The fourth challenge is one that's probably familiar to a lot of you, and that is a challenge of science versus religion and how this plays out politically. And when people think about this issue, they tend to think about creationism and evolution. And that is a live controversy right now in this country, believe me. There's a lot going on. But it's a little more than that. You know, this affects issues like stem cell research, right to die laws, and even questions like what happens when a public hospital merges with a Catholic hospital and what types of provisions and directives are placed on people as they seek to get medical care. It includes things like whether you're going to have the ability to get a pharmacist to provide you with your medication that a doctor has prescribed for you, or whether the pharmacist is going to be able to claim a conscience right not to fill a certain prescription. I mean, there's a lot happening here beyond the creation evolution. The creation evolution issue is still very active. We're seeing bills designed to introduce some type of creationism, usually intelligent design, they call it now, into about 9 states. So we're definitely watching that. We're definitely keeping an eye on that. Many of you may remember that back in 1987, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a Louisiana law that mandated so-called balanced treatment between evolution and creationism. So the schools were expected to treat both equally. Well, the Supreme Court struck that down in the case from Louisiana. But the creationists are, I mean, ironically, they evolve. They have a defeat, and they come back with something else. So when creation science was struck down, they renamed their idea evidence against evolution, they called it. Well, that didn't work. And then they called it, this was my favorite, the theory of abrupt appearance. Tried that one for a while. Well, that didn't work either. Then they tried, this was a good one too, they got a few school districts in the South to adopt policies where they were pasting disclaimers into the biology book. So at the beginning of the book, there would be this piece of paper pasted in here, and it would say something like, this textbook discusses evolution. Evolution is a controversial theory, and you should consider all arguments before, deciding where you stand on this. Well, court struck that down too. There was one district in the Atlanta suburbs where they actually had to go back and hire a firm to remove all the stickers from the textbook. It cost them $80,000. Now, can you imagine what they could have done in the classroom with $80,000? A lot of textbooks, a lot of equipment, but they spent that instead on ripping disclaimers out of textbooks. So they didn't win that one. And then they came up with intelligent design. And that was the case in Pennsylvania that Americans United litigated with the ACLU of Pennsylvania in the city of Dover. An excellent ruling by Judge John E. Jones, who was appointed to the court by President George W. Bush, by the way. So not all Bush's appointments were terrible, just like 95% of them were. We got lucky. We got one of the good ones. Struck down intelligent design in a very powerful opinion, and that hasn't stopped these folks. They just keep coming back with new laws and new ways of doing things. And what they're doing now is, in many states, they're pushing what they say is a broader approach. They say, we want our science teachers to teach the controversy in 3 areas, 3 controversial areas: global warming, human cloning, and evolution. And of course, evolution is really the only one of those issues that's routinely discussed in a high school biology class. So they're really targeting evolution again. Now, there's some good news here. This bill was introduced in Oklahoma. That was one of the states where it was introduced in, right? Now, you would think, Oklahoma, I mean, that's, they're going to pass that in a minute, right? Oklahoma is a state where they're trying to ban Islamic law, after all, because it's a real threat there, So, but they didn't pass it. I mean, amazingly, they did not pass this bill. It was defeated in Oklahoma. So that gave us big boost. We're thinking, wow, they couldn't even get this thing through in Oklahoma. We can probably defeat it in other states as well. So we're working with the National Center for Science Education in California, which is a group that supports the teaching of evolution in schools, to stop these bills in the other states. We'd rather stop them legislatively than have to go back into court. Going to court is expensive. It's time-consuming. It's better to defeat them in the legislature. That's what we're working on doing. So that's the challenge of science versus religion. The next challenge is the challenge of history. And what I mean by this is, it actually has some parallels to creationism. What's happening in some states, I call it historical creationism. You have these individuals that have sort of invented this new history of America. that they're foisting onto the schools. This has manifested itself most prominently in Texas. You might have read about the Texas State Board of Education that was revising the state social studies history standards. And they removed all the references to Thomas Jefferson. They removed all the references to separation of church and state. And they put in a bunch of stuff about how we're based on the Bible and our laws are based on Christianity and we're a Christian nation, all this kind of stuff, none of which is in the Constitution, none of which is in the writing of the founders. And they put it in there anyway. And all this comes out of a guy named David Barton, who is not a historian, who does not have a degree in this area. He has a degree from Oral Roberts University in Christian education. All right? Now, I like to read history, just as a hobby, but I don't call myself a historian. My degree is in journalism. I'm not a lawyer either. I just play one on TV. So I don't hold myself out as a historian. But David Barton does, and he's not. But he's taken seriously by states like Texas, who take his views and tried to put them into the state standards. And because Texas is a big state, and because Texas buys a lot of textbooks, there is a threat, possibly, that these textbooks could end up in other areas of the country. So we definitely have to keep an eye on this. And the broader question here, the broader threat, is that there are people on the religious right essentially trying to rewrite the history of this nation because they don't like the actual history. Just as they don't like the actual science of evolution, so they come up with something else. They don't like the history that we were founded as a secular nation, that our founders wanted there to be a separation of church and state, so they've just come up with another one, the Christian nation theory, which it's not even a theory because it's demonstrably false. But that's what they're putting out there. That's the challenge of history. And it's ironic because I read what these guys say about the founders, and I have to just laugh because consider Thomas Jefferson, for example. You know, you can go and you can see what Thomas Jefferson believed about the interaction between religion and government and just religion, what he thought about religion personally. Remember that Thomas Jefferson is the guy who took the New Testament and cut out all the stuff he didn't believe in. He didn't believe in the divinity of Jesus. He didn't believe in the resurrection. He didn't believe in the virgin birth. He didn't believe in the miracles described in the New Testament. So he cut all that out, and he pasted up what was left. And he called it the life and morals of Jesus Christ, or the Jefferson Bible. Now, Jefferson was not an Orthodox Christian, obviously. He admired the moral teachings of Jesus. But if you listen to guys like David Barton and some of these folks on the religious right, they talk about Thomas Jefferson like he was Jerry Falwell in a powdered wig. This is what they tell people. And because people don't know about Jefferson, they believe it. Just as an aside, imagine if we had a politician today who did that, who took the New Testament, just cut out all that stuff about the resurrection, that stuff about the miracles, that stuff about Jesus being divine. I really don't believe that. He couldn't be elected dog catcher. Isn't that a shame? Thomas Jefferson, probably one of the most intellectual individuals ever to occupy the White House, could not be elected today to almost any public office if those views were known. That's sad. So that's the challenge of history. This idea that we're based on the Ten Commandments. I once heard a religious right advocate at a conference argue seriously, this is not a joke, that our Constitution was based on the Bible because it has 3 branches of government, just like the Trinity. I don't make this stuff up, okay? It's all true. The challenge of history. The next challenge is one that definitely we're going to be hearing a lot about. It's the challenge of tolerance. And again, this is something where the religious right's been very active lately. When I talk about the challenge of tolerance, I talk about the fact that this nation allows religious liberty for everybody. That includes the right to believe or not believe what you like as long as you live peacefully within the laws of the country. And there are organizations right now on the religious right that would like to deny those rights to certain individuals. Let me read to you something that appeared the other day on a website of a group called the American Family Association. I don't know if any of you know this group. It was founded in the late 1970s when the religious right really started to take off by a minister named Donald Wildman. His original focus was he was going to clean up salacious television programming. Obviously, he's had great success. You hardly ever turn on television and see any trash talk or anything. So he kind of branched out over the years. That wasn't going too well for him. This was the guy who used to boycott different advertising or different firms that he didn't like that were advertising on shows he didn't like. But he's branched out. And he's got a guy on his staff named Brian Fisher. And Brian Fisher has a reputation for really trying to be outrageous and saying things that are quite extreme on a blog that this group runs. And he had a column the other day. Let me read to you what he wrote in part. The First Amendment was written by the founders to protect the free exercise of Christianity. They were making no effort to give special protections to Islam. Islam is entitled only to the religious liberty we extend to it out of courtesy. From a constitutional point of view, Muslims have no First Amendment right to build mosques in America. They have that privilege at the moment, but it is a privilege that can be revoked. Now, I don't know where that is in the Constitution. And, a lot of people brought this up, and it was on the web, and you might have seen it floating around. If you have a Facebook page, a lot of folks were posting it because it was so outrageous. But this is a serious argument that he's making. I mean, it's not serious in the sense that any court's going to take it seriously, but it's serious in the sense that he believes it, and a lot of religious right activists believe it. Now, I want to be clear about one thing. Any religious organization that engages, or members of a religious organization that engage in violence or terrorism, they can claim no protection under our Constitution. Obviously, it does not give any aid and comfort to acts like that. But the decision to build a house of worship in this country, once you have met the local zoning laws, is not an act of terrorism. And there are people in this country right now on the religious right who would deny that fundamental freedom to groups just because they don't like them. And it isn't just Lower Manhattan, near the Ground Zero site. It's also in cities in Tennessee and in other communities around the country where people are in court arguing that Muslims should not have the right to build mosques simply because they don't like Muslims. They haven't been able to make any other argument. So we're seeing this being seriously raised. And interestingly enough, there's a religious right organization that works in the courts. It's founded by Pat Robertson, called the American Center for Law and Justice. And they are litigating against the so-called Ground Zero mosque, which, by the way, isn't near Ground Zero and isn't a mosque. But they're litigating against that, saying that, well, people are offended, so they shouldn't be able to build that mosque. Well, you know what? I'm offended by things fundamentalists say and do, but that doesn't mean I'm going to stand up and try to stop them from building a church. If they've met the local zoning requirements, they're meeting the local laws, of course they have the right to do that. That's a fundamental First Amendment freedom. Yet we have people today arguing in this country, the country that founded religious liberty, the beacon of religious freedom, that certain groups shouldn't have that right, and these people have the nerve to stand up and say they're standing up for religious freedom? It's ridiculous. So that's where we are with some of this challenge of tolerance. I often tell people, it's not religion that's the problem when we're talking about separation of church and state. It's fundamentalism. And fundamentalism, especially as it is expressed politically, appears in lots of different religions. There are fundamentalist Jews. There are fundamentalist Hindus. There are even fundamentalist Buddhists. You don't hear much about them because their presence in this country probably isn't that big. I mean, they're active in other parts of the world. But they're out there, and some of them engage in terrorism, and some of them engage in violence, and that is something the state should act against every time. But the ones who are living in peace, the ones who are renouncing terrorism, should not be lumped in. We should not paint with so broad a brush. Islam is a religion of 1 billion people in the world. And whenever you have someone painting 1 billion people monolithically, you know something isn't right. I would urge you to be very careful and be very wary of anybody who tells you that we have to shred our Constitution in order to save it. Because those two simply cannot exist. Be wary of anybody who tells you that we must violate our core freedoms. And when you look at people or listen to people like Newt Gingrich, who's been talking a lot about this lately, Newt Gingrich just gave a speech at a church in Texas where he said, again, I'm not making this up, some of you might have read about this, that he was worried that in the next few years, America was going to be run by radical atheists and kowtowing to radical Islam. Those two don't get along. Somebody should point that out to Newt. You can't have a country that is simultaneously officially atheist and officially Muslim. That wouldn't work. And you know what? I don't know, the number of the Muslims in the country is disputed, but it's estimated to be about 1.5%. I don't really think they're in a position yet to take over and impose Sharia. Yet there are people arguing that we have to pass special laws to ban Sharia because it's going to be somehow integrated into our legal system. So when you hear people making these arguments, saying that we have to violate our Constitution in order to save it, ask yourself, what are they really after? What they're trying to get you to do is surrender to fear. And the reason they want you to surrender to fear is because they want political power and or money. That's what Newt Gingrich is all about. That's what Newt Gingrich wants, power. And the way he wants to get power is by getting you to surrender to fear. And he's not the only one playing that game. There are other people out there, Sarah Palin, Michelle Bachmann, some of these other television activists and preachers and political leaders, trying to get us to do this, to be afraid. And I'm not going to live that way, and I would urge you to be the same way too. The next challenge we have to deal with, beyond the challenge of tolerance, is a related challenge, and that is the challenge of diversity. And what I mean by this is the country is changing in ways that are very profound, that are going to challenge us in the future to think differently about some issues that maybe we haven't really given much thought to in the past, that are becoming very prominent now. And we're going to have to be challenging the religious right more and more to be engaging in a dialogue that, as hard as it is for me to imagine, is a little more rational than what they've offered in the past. Let me give you an example of this. I live in the state of Maryland. Americans United is based in Washington, D.C., but I live in Maryland with my wife and children. And we had a situation in Maryland recently where the legislature was trying to pass same-sex marriage, trying to pass a bill to approve same-sex marriage. And it looked like it was going to pass. It had cleared the state Senate. It was in the House of Delegates. They thought they had the votes lined up for it. But then 2 delegates flipped their votes, and the bill went down. And when they asked why they flipped their votes, they said, well, we've been getting a lot of calls from ministers in our jurisdiction, and we got scared. And the calls are running 25-1 against same-sex marriage. Now, some of these ministers were interviewed by the Washington Post. And let me read you a couple things they said about the same-sex marriage bill. One minister said, I have spoken about it in any number of times because I stand firm on the Word of God. Another minister said, this is a man named Paul Wells, the Bible says homosexuality is an abomination before God. God created the institution of marriage and made marriage between a man and a woman. People ask me all the time, would you marry a gay couple? I say absolutely not. I welcome those who are homosexuals into the church in the same way that I welcome liars and fornicators. But the expectation is that the Word of God will change their behavior. Now, the interesting thing about arguments like that is they don't even try to pretend that there's any non-religious reason for stopping same-sex marriage. And the Catholic Church, the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, which was very active in this as well, did the same thing. They said, well, the Pope doesn't like it, and the bishops don't like it. And the Protestant fundamentalist ministers in our state said, well, it's against Leviticus. We can't have this. Well, let me clue you in on something about Leviticus. Leviticus said, well, I think we're pretty much all in violation of Leviticus right now. Anybody who's wearing a shirt or pants of mixed fiber is violating Leviticus. Now, if you have something with polyester in it, I'm going to give you a little leeway on that. You're technically not a fiber. But if you've recently touched a football, you are violating Leviticus because you touched the skin of a pig. Okay, so there's a lot of things in Leviticus that we don't actually base our society on anymore. Yet they continue to pull this one section of Leviticus out and hold this up as if that should have any relevance. It doesn't. We don't base our laws on what Leviticus says. We base them on the Constitution. So we have folks here making arguments that aren't even remotely non-religious. They have no secular arguments at all. And we're seeing a lot of these bills go down simply because people are getting worked up on religious grounds. So it's something that we're going to have to be aware of and working on. I think this is an issue that's going to become extremely prominent in the years to come because the country is just about ready to flip. There have been a couple of polls that have shown for the first time a bare majority saying that, yes, they support same-sex marriage. It's like 51, 52%. And the interesting thing is, the generation that's coming up next is much more favorable to the idea, even among self-identified evangelicals. Self-identified evangelicals are still strongly anti-abortion. They don't like it. But on same-sex marriage and gay rights, their thinking is pretty much, not a big deal. I have gay friends. I know gay people. I don't care anymore about it. So that is going to really, I think, cause us as a society to revisit a lot of these laws that have been passed or constitutional amendments that have been passed. I understand there's one here in Oregon. There's one in other states. And my hope is that we will live to see the day when a lot of those are overturned. And if I don't live to see it, I'm sure my children will. So that is going to be a process that is, again, going to energize the religious right. They're going to be very active in that, but I think they're going to be on the losing end of it, but it's not going to happen without a bit of a struggle. And if you look at some of the history here, you can see that this isn't a thing we've been through before. The religious right fought the women's rights movement and fought other rights-based movements over the years, and they always sort of harken back to this golden age of some sort of Ozzie and Harriet in America that never really existed outside of TV sitcoms, but they hold that up as a reality and something we need to get back to, not understanding that things have changed to the point where that isn't going to happen. So that's the challenge of diversity. The next challenge is the challenge of, I call it generic religiosity. And what I mean by this is the courts seem to be moving toward an adoption of a sort of watered-down, one-size-fits-all version of religion that they say is acceptable to most people. We already have some manifestations of this. Think about your currency. In God we trust, it says. And they slipped under God into the Pledge of Allegiance during the Cold War. And the courts have looked at these things, and the courts have said, oh, you know, it's no big deal. It's not specific to any religion. It doesn't say in Jesus Christ we trust. So it's okay. The courts have even come up with a name for this phenomenon. They call it ceremonial deism. I don't know, ceremonial deism. I would think we can't establish a religion of ceremonial deism more than we can establish a religion of Christianity, but the courts have given a blessing to this type of generic religiosity, so we're stuck with it. And it's starting to spread. There was a case recently before the Supreme Court dealing with the display of a giant cross on top of a mountain near San Diego. This cross it's been displayed on and off since the 1920s. In the late 1980s, it was a memorial. Everybody acknowledged it was just a that endorsed Christianity. But they wanted to say it's a war memorial. And meanwhile, a lot of people started saying, wait a minute, we're not Christian, and that doesn't memorialize our dead. But we actually have Supreme Court justices, Justice Scalia is one of them, who are arguing now or asserting that a cross is a generic memorial for all war dead. When this case was argued before the Supreme Court, Scalia, he argued that to the attorney that was handling the case. The attorney had a good response. He said, well, you know, Justice Scalia, if that were the case, you'd see a lot more crosses in Jewish cemeteries, wouldn't you? But, you know, Scalia doesn't care. Scalia doesn't believe in separation of church and state. Scalia thinks the majority should have the right to rule. So Scalia doesn't have a problem with a cross memorializing everybody when it doesn't. And this is a strange trend. I mean, to me, it's something that the sincerely religious ought to be the first to be concerned about this. When you have the government saying that the central symbol of Christianity, the cross, is no longer religious, that's not a good thing for religion. So they ought to be the first ones to speak out, but they are so eager to keep their symbols up in public places, like this mountaintop near San Diego, that they're willing to put up with that. And it's a disturbing thing, and you're seeing other manifestations of this. You know, you might have had disputes in this area about prayers before municipal bodies, and maybe if you have prayers before your state government, somebody comes in and reads a so-called non-denominational prayer. We know there really isn't such a thing. And even if there were, why would you want to establish that as your state religion? We should have neutrality. If a member of the legislature feels the need for divine guidance during the day, you know, I think there are probably, I was just in Salem. I gave a speech in there before I came up here. There are churches there. I saw several of them. So the lawmakers can get spiritual guidance if they need it from the churches in Salem or the churches in their district. They don't need to have this 30-second non-denominational prayer before the state government that nobody even listens to anyway. But again, the courts have kind of given this a pass and have argued that it's not really a problem, but it's going to be a problem. And the reason it's going to be a problem is that society is changing. And I want to talk about that right now as I talk about opportunities. You know, it's not enough to just stand here and tell you that we have all these challenges. We have to examine the opportunities that grow out of those challenges. And one of the opportunities is the changing face of religion in America. That's definitely something that's real and it's happening and it's been documented by scholars who look at these issues. There's an interesting phenomenon underway. America for a long time was kind of a culturally Christian nation in the sense that, not legally, but culturally, in the sense that more than 90% of people, if asked, would say that they were Christian. Well, now that number has dropped. It's mid to high 70s. You know, you ask people, are you Christian? What's your religion? Somewhere between 75 to 78% will say that they belong to a Christian denomination. Interestingly, there's been a large increase in the number of people who say they have no religion. Now, that doesn't mean they're believers, but it means that they are sort of adopting a spirituality outside of the confines of traditional churches. The average church in America over the past decade lost 13% of its members. So people are not necessarily turning away from religion, as they have in some European nations, but they're turning away from organized religion and dogma, and they're sort of doing it themselves. I mean, you've probably heard people, you may know people, some of you may feel this way yourself, who will say, well, I'm not necessarily religious, but I'm spiritual. You hear that a lot. And that's a perfectly valid expression of faith in a free country. So people are looking for that sort of spiritual experience outside of the traditional houses of worship. And that's going to have an effect. Because the religious right and the opponents of separation of church and state, they don't really like people having those religious experiences outside of the confines of a church. So they're pushing back against that. And those individuals who feel that way are, to my way of thinking, our natural allies. They should be involved in the drive to maintain the separation of church and state, because if those two get combined, their right to sort of explore religion and to adopt different faiths or to blend things together from different sources will be jeopardized. So that's an opportunity. We also have an opportunity in the rise of what you might call some fairly new religions in America, some of the nature-based faiths that are gaining members, Wicca and paganism and so on. Again, the religious right does not like these people. Believe me, I see what they say on their websites about them. So we should be reaching out to those communities and bringing them on board. And they already are active. I mean, I encounter a lot of folks from those traditions when I'm speaking, and they know the threat of the religious right. But to the extent that they have not been contacted or not been brought in, we should be thinking about ways to get them involved, because, again, their religious freedom would not be safe under a religious right version of America. We also have an opportunity by reminding people where we have been. And this is one that especially we need to be thinking about whenever you're talking to what America used to be like. And we have to remind them, especially those of you who live through I'm going to talk about, I would, because people take their rights for granted. Let me give you a couple of examples. Abortion is legal because the Supreme Court in 1973 said that it should be legal. And many of you in this room may remember the days when it wasn't, and what happened to women who sought to get that procedure anyway, and folks who died, and people who were imprisoned or what have you. It isn't something that is always going to be here simply because the Supreme Court said it was legal in 1973. The Supreme Court can change that ruling. And I'm amazed sometimes that young people sometimes don't really grasp that. They think that a Supreme Court decision comes down, it's written in stone, it can't be overturned. Well, of course they can overturn it. And if they had enough votes, they would have done it already. So be reminding them about that. Be reminding them about issues of censorship, religiously based censorship that used to be very common in this country. In the 1950s, religious groups had the power to censor films, books, magazines. Even in enlightened New York City, the Catholic Church had the power to suppress films if they thought they were heretical. And it took, again, a Supreme Court ruling. Catholic Church suppressed this film by an Italian filmmaker that was kind of a contemporary retelling of the virgin birth. And they didn't care for this contemporary retelling of that story, so they tried to suppress this film, and they did. And it took someone fighting, the director of the film, fighting all the way to the Supreme Court to stop that. But that was not that long ago. 1950s. Think about how hard it used to be for even married couples in some states to get artificial forms of birth control. The Griswold case came down in the early 1960s. Again, not so long ago that it was difficult to get these things. Think about how we used to deal with the area of religion in public schools. Well, the majority ruled. Most people are Protestant Christians, so we're going to have Protestant prayers. We're going to read the Lord's Prayer. We're going to read from the King James Version of the Bible. And if you don't like it, too bad. Again, 1962 and 1963 were when those cases came down, ending those practices. And there are many people, if they could, who would very much like to return to those days when everybody was coerced to say their prayer or take part in their form of religious worship. Remind people what it was like before we had a modern women's rights movement, when women were restricted to certain professions, when they were expected to stay home and raise children. That was their job. That's what the religious right told a lot of people for a long time, and that's what they still tell people. So some of these rights that we have and some of these ways we look of living in our life, we think about, oh, it's okay, it's no problem, this is going to change. It can change. The opportunity there is to remind everyone, especially the younger generation, that you should never take your rights for granted. They are never quite secure. Sometimes people ask me, well, what do you want? What's the end result of separation of church and state? And I'll tell you, I can sum it up in one word: neutrality. You want government neutrality on religion. I don't want the government taking sides on theological issues, People have argued about theology since the dawn of time, and they've killed each other over theology for a long time too. They've fought wars. They've massacred people. They have done all manner of awful things. They've done some good things in the name of religion too, certainly, but they have fought a lot over it. That's why I don't want the state taking sides. I don't even think it's proper for the state to be taking sides on whether God exists or not. Not the state's business. Yet the state does take that stand. They put in God we trust on our money. They put under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. They would not do those things if they were not assuming that there was a God. And when they take that type of a stand, it does more than simply affirm that there's a God. It says something about that God. That it's a God we can put our trust in. And it's one God. It's not gods. That it's some type of a being that we can have a relationship with. And not everybody who believes in God perceives God that way. So the state needs to be completely neutral on matters of theology, not taking a stand on any of these issues. That's what we're striving toward. I want to wrap up by reading you a quote by someone that I'm quite fond of, who lived a long time ago. When I speak to groups, I sometimes end with a quote by Thomas Jefferson or James Madison. Well, I'm not going to do that tonight, even though I love those guys. This is a gentleman who was a friend with Thomas Jefferson. His name is John Leland. He was a Baptist minister. He lived during the colonial era. John Leland has an unusual distinction in American history in that he helped end state-established churches in 3 states. He helped Thomas Jefferson and James Madison do it in Virginia. Then he went up to Massachusetts. He did it there. And while living in Massachusetts, he would make border raids over into Connecticut and help people there do it too. So ended state-established religion in 3 states. John Leland was very conservative theologically, almost a fundamentalist in some ways, but he was a powerful advocate for the separation of church and state. And he wrote this famous sermon in 1791. And let me read you the title of this sermon because it's actually kind of amusing. This was back before the days when all news was offered in sound bites. So John Leland's title is a little unwieldy. Here it is. The rights of conscience inalienable, and therefore religious opinions not cognizable by law. Or the high-flying churchman is stripped of his legal robe and appears to be a Yahoo. It's good, isn't it? I like it. It's a certain quirky charm to it. I'm going to read to you 2 short passages. Remember, this is John Leland writing in 1791, so he's using very sexist language. That's what they did back then. Every man must give account of himself to God, and therefore every man ought to be at liberty to serve God in that way that he can best reconcile it to his conscience. If government can answer for individuals at the day of judgment, let men be controlled by it in religious matters. Otherwise, let men be free. Leland goes on to say, is conformity of sentiment in matters of religion essential to the happiness of civil government? Not at all. Government has no more to do with the religious opinions of men than it has to do with the principles of mathematics. Let every man speak freely without fear, maintain the principles that he believes in, worship according to his own faith, either one God, 3 gods, no God, or 20 gods, and let government protect him in doing so. Let his doctrines, if they are false, be confuted. If true, let others credit them. When every man has this liberty, what more can he wish for? A liberal man asks for nothing more of his government. We need more Baptists like that today, don't we? That's what I want. I want what John Leland said back in 1791. Thank you.